Okay, well, we should get started since we have a surplus of great speakers and much ground to cover, and we want to have plenty of time for your comments and questions at the end. In fact, when that time comes up, please let us know. Please give us your name and who you're with. But we do invite comments and questions, so think about that. Welcome to New America and to Fueling the Broadband Economy. My name is Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future program here in the Open Technology Institute here at New America. And I guess for the record, just so you know, Open Technology Institute is part of the Competitive Coalition, along with quite a few other consumer and public interest groups, companies, associations, and so on, some of which you'll hear from today. And I'd like to, of course, thank the Competitive folks for their help with this event over at the Glen Echo Group. So high-capacity broadband lines are what the FCC calls Business Data Services, or BDS. So that's an acronym you need to remember. And BDS are increasingly critical to connecting the digital economy, from banks, retailers and businesses, to schools, libraries, and hospitals. In fact, it's really, in a way, the same kind of perspective that the Commission had a year or so ago when they adopted the Open Internet Order, the idea that increasingly broadband connectivity is like electricity in the economy. It's an input into everything else. And so whether you are operating a small business, using a smartphone for calls and internet access, or withdrawing money at a local ATM, a BDS connection is powering your connection to the internet. Unfortunately, we're here today because the market for BDS is extremely concentrated and non-competitive. On Wednesday, speaking at the big CTIA conference, Chairman Wheeler said, he addressed this and promised a vote on reforms this year. He said competition in the supply of backhaul remains limited, and that can translate into higher costs for wireless networks, higher prices for consumers, and an adverse impact on competition in general. Typically, the former monopoly telephone provider in each region, AT&T, Verizon, and CenturyLink, remain the monopoly wireline provider of BDS because they have this legacy wireline infrastructure that's been paid for, through the rate base over decades. According to a massive data collection by the FCC, 73% of locations across the country are served by a monopoly BDS provider, so no choice, and 97% by no more than two. This lack of competition poses real problems for the future of the broadband economy, including 5G wireless networks and the emerging Internet of Things. After 10 long years of data collection and debate, the FCC is finally poised to reform the business broadband marketplace. As I mentioned, Chairman Wheeler said Wednesday that he will bring this reform in order to a vote before the end of the year. And the Commission will be deciding how and when to impose a price cap, as well as other reforms on the broken BDS market. So on the eve of this historic decision, our panel, representing a range of stakeholders, will discuss the need for the FCC to move quickly and decisively on this reform. So because this is such an important economic issue, and also so important to the mobile market, which is the particular interest of my program. We'll hear first from Dr. Raul Katz, President of Telecom Advisory Services. Dr. Katz will present his new paper assessment of the impact of BDS market dynamics on innovation and competition in the U.S. wireless market. He examines how the BDS marketplace today harms innovation and competition among competitive wireless service providers. Immediately following Dr. Katz, we have a panel of experts who will discuss the importance of competition in the critical BDS market and its impact on things including rural investment, the future of 5G, community anchor institutions such as schools and libraries, and the impact on closing the digital divide. So at that time, we'll be joined on stage by Stephen Barry from Competitive Carriers Association, Matt Wood from Free Press, John Windhausen, the Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition, Colleen Boothby, the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee, and Angie Cronenberg, who's Chief Advocate for Encompass. But I'll introduce them one more time as they come up. So we can bring Dr. Katz up at this time and get going. Raul Katz is President of Telecom Advisory Services, LLP, and Director of Business Strategy Research at Columbia University's Institute for Teleinformation, CITI.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Whenever I tackle a policy issue, I like to start by trying to think, what are the objectives that we're trying to maximize? In many proceedings, in many discussions, not only in the United States, but around the world, people sometimes get mired into the weeds of particular remedies or monitoring mechanisms. And in the course of the discussion, we lose perspective as to what are we trying to achieve through this kind of discussion, this kind of policy decision. And in that sense, I'm going to tag along some of the comments that were made before. We have a big issue in our country about digital divide. We have a big issue about rural migration, hollowing out of rural areas, lack of economic development. So what we're trying to do here is to maximize the opportunity of a general purpose technology such as wireless to have a positive effect countering those negative trends. And so how can we maximize the role, the value, the possibilities that wireless technology can have in addressing some of these ongoing negative factors? And it is in that context that we are talking about this issue that might sound a little cryptic, but nevertheless is critical for the future sustainability both of competition and 5G services, particularly wireless services in rural areas. I'm going to go, sometimes I'm going to skip some slides because I obviously have a limited amount of time, and but hopefully you get a sense of what are the key conclusions and some of the evidence that was raised on the data regarding how harmful is the current situation, the pricing situation of business data services for the sustainability of the wireless industry in rural areas and for wireless consumers. And I'm going to address that in three areas, in particular the issue of investment. And this has very little to do with the future. It's just primarily to what extent pricing is so high at the backhaul level that is preventing wireless carriers operating in rural areas to invest more in just accommodate for the growing traffic that is affecting the industry. The second one is how quality of service is declining, and why is that backhaul pricing is affecting the quality of service and ultimately the sustainability of rural carriers. And finally, I'm going to get into the future and trying to bring everything back to the impact on rural areas. So I don't think I need to belabor the point about what wireless backhaul is, but essentially just to have a level play on the discussion, it's essentially the infrastructure that enables a wireless carrier to connect the different cell sites among themselves to the switching facility and to interconnect with other carriers. So essentially, it's the skeleton of a wireless carrier. And in order to gain access to that particular input in the wireless value chain, Carriers can do several things. They can obviously first deploy service and build their own facilities. Could be microwave, it could be faster, infrastructure, it could be fiber. Secondly, they can go and acquire that from a provider, and this goes back to what Michael was talking about before. In many cases, in most cases around the country, there's a single provider for that kind of a facility. And that's my second dot point. The third is I have a competitive sort of situation where there's more than one provider, and therefore the rules of competition is somewhat affecting pricing, as one might expect. And the fourth is just some areas where there's really intense competition. When you have a duopoly, prices might drop by 10%, but when you have 3 or 4 carriers serving a particular cell site, prices drop like 50%. Those are the wonders of competition, except that there are very few locations, 3% around the country, where a wireless carrier is encountering that kind of situation. So by virtue of that, you have market concentration on the provision of these wireless backhaul, and therefore prices are very high. And what we are examining are these 4 questions. To what extent that is impacting the amount of money that a wireless carrier can dedicate to capital spend. The second one is whether service quality is being eroded as a result of this. The fourth is whether that is impacting in a negative fashion their possibility of them migrating to 5th generation technology. And finally, what would happen in rural areas of the country. And obviously, the answer to these questions from a top-line basis is that this is negative. I mean, prices are impacting the ability. So this is like, this is the answer to the questions that we studied. But rather than just going through these, I'll give you some of the evidence that supports some of the statements. And I'm going to start with the first one on affecting investment. And I'm going to give you a couple of premises here. Why is it that high prices will affect the level of investment? Well, it's just because wireless carriers have a limited amount of money. And if they have to spend a lot of money in purchasing backhaul services because prices are very high, what is being left to invest in network deployment is going to be reduced. So the premise also that we're saying, if we were to limit pricing, if we were to establish some sort of a control of the ability of those monopoly providers of pricing these wireless backhaul, then there would be more money dedicated to the deployment of networks. How are we going to prove this? Well, I'm going to start here. What you see here is, I apologize in advance for the numbers, but basically you start with what does a financial statement of an income statement of a wireless carrier look like? And this is a very small carrier, as you can see, $26 million in revenues. It's a very small carrier. You see there are lots of companies of this size serving rural America. And out of those 26 million, 20.7 million go into operating expenditures. So this is like keeping the machine running. Now, what portion of those monies are being spent in purchasing backhaul? And this is where we really dug deep into understanding, either through benchmarking or through interviews, through bottom-up analysis, talking to vendors. And what you see is a range that goes from 2.25 to almost 6%. So 6% of OpEx is being spent on purchasing backhaul. Now, why is there a range? Well, because it depends on the number of cell sites, how many links are being purchased from someone else versus the ones that are owned by the carrier. And because there are so many differences, we decided to keep the 3 data points. So considering that, then a big premise, and very conservative, was that 50% of the backhaul is owned by the carrier and 50% is being purchased from one of these providers. And we assume that if we were to drop the price, that would mean savings for the wireless carrier. Drop the price. And our assumption in dropping the price were several price points. The most dramatic one, or the most important one, was a 60% drop in pricing of backhaul services. Now, you might say, well, that's enormous. Who could possibly drop 60%? But it's very interesting because in interviews, when we talk to these rural carriers, what they tell us is that if they encounter those situations where there is competition versus the monopoly ones, prices drop by 50%. 50%. So we said, well, let's assume 60% savings, and that, obviously, because it's 50% of that backhaul is being purchased outside, that creates $369,000. Now, you might say, well, how important is this? Is this real money? It is real money for these carriers, because just for you to know, if I were to install electronics on top of a silo in a rural area, that is costing a carrier $40,000. So you can have an extra cell site for $40,000, and at this amount of money, that's important for a small operator of this type. Now, we were also assuming that not all these monies were going to be spent dollar for dollar on CapEx, on network deployment, because experience shows that part of these savings that we've incurred by these regulatory moves will basically go to booster their margins. But 85% would go to increase capital spend, and that's where the numbers come. So we're talking about, in the best case, 7% of increase in the CapEx of this little carrier. So we're talking, again, $314,000. It's a very important saving, a very important contribution for capital spending. It's going to make a difference in one of these small rural operators. So that's the first item that we've proven. The second one had to do with quality of service. And let's start with something that everyone knows, that traffic in the wireless industry in the United States is growing by leaps and bounds. Total traffic has been growing at 65%, primarily boosted by video, and it's forecast to grow at 57%. And even if I take out whatever traffic is being rerouted through Wi-Fi facilities, traffic is growing at close to 45% every year. So carriers need to support this traffic. They have three options. The first one is, obviously, I would acquire more spectrum because I have more people or more traffic going in, I increase the spectrum. Just keep me honest on the time, please. The second option is I could move to to technologies that are more efficient in terms of compressing the signal. Obviously 4G, and in the future maybe 5G. We're going to come back to that second point later. And the third is what they are doing right now. Some people call it cell densification, others call them cell splitting, which is basically, I have a cell with a tower, my traffic grows, I divide the cell in two and I put another tower. The rule of thumb is if I put another tower, my backhaul cost, this link back to the switching facility, doubles, because now I have two sides. So here's the quandary that rural carriers encounter. We have the traffic growth, as I mentioned before, the need to split the cell, and they are facing two different situations. If the need to split the cell is located in an area where there's enough competition, with prices 50% under than what it is in a monopoly area, it's a no-brainer. The business case is there to split the cell. But what happens in 73% of the cases? In fact, what happens in 97% of the cases, because as I said before, 24% of the cases, there are two carriers, prices drop only 10%. And that's the quandary. Because in the words of a carrier that I interviewed, they say, in those cases, when our business case does not close properly, we just sit down and wait for the customer to churn, to leave us. Because they say, well, and we've been studying these to death. When service quality degrades, customers tend to leave probably in 2 quarters. Not immediately, but in 2 quarters you say, you give up. This is bad quality, I move out. So what happens then is that you have increasing churn, and as a result of that, declining market share, and ultimately what you see is limited sustainability. That rural carrier is with declining share, they have these fixed costs, they cannot sustain competition, so they give up. The second option, which is the bottom line, is that the customer doesn't have anywhere to go. because there's no competitor that has good quality. Who suffers there? The customer, because the customer is left with bad service. So this issue of prices being too high is impacting quality of service and ultimately impacting either consumers in a negative fashion or the sustainability of competition in rural areas. So that's the answer to the second problem. Let's move to the third one, which is 5G. So no matter which way you look at it, you talk to engineers, you talk to executives, everyone says that the key problem in 5G is the cost of backhaul. And even if you're not an engineer, you can recognize that because you say, well, if I'm multiplying exponentially the number of cell sites, if I'm multiplying the number of, the amount of traffic that is going through those pipes, I'll have to deal with this exponential growth in backhaul. So surveys say that, backhaul being the dominant problem, and engineers say that, and they're trying to figure out, well, how are we going to solve this problem? Because under current conditions, this is going to be a big, under current pricing conditions, this is a non-starter. So it's even more a non-starter because some carriers are considering that if you want to move to 5G, the standard will be you have to deploy an overlay of a backhaul network. So you cannot recycle your 4G backhaul. You have to deploy a new one. Just think about it. Not only cell sites are exponentially much numerous, now you have to buy an overlay, another set of backhaul links. So for this reason, every single interview of a carrier that we did in the course of the study said 5G is nowhere near our short-term or long-term plans because we cannot afford it. I mean, just because backhaul is so important and it's so expensive, forget it. This is nowhere near. So what happens with this situation? Well, what happens is that what in management research we call the first entrant competitive advantage, the first mover competitive advantage. You have two carriers, AT&T and Verizon, that have planned to move to 5G, and they have in their time horizon 2020 as the time where they're going to move. They are trialing already. Even if you look, oops, I did a wrong thing. Even if you look at the cellular connections by generation, you see that by 2020, and 4G is going to be at a point where you're going to be ready to start rolling. So independently of what they tell you, you know that 2020 is key for AT&T and Verizon. So you got AT&T and Verizon that are going to move in that direction, and the rest of the operators, particularly the rural ones, that say we cannot afford it. Now, these first mover advantage is fundamental because we've studied this to death, showing that if you move ahead, you achieve a faster scale and scope, you achieve faster learning curve on how to operate the technology, your brand is more identified with the names of those two, with that technology. So if you think 5G, you think AT&T and Verizon, you don't think about a rural carrier. So ultimately, these starts building itself, perpetuating, accelerating this trend towards concentration. So what we might end up is a situation that is highly concentrated. Now this, you saw now three trends. Particularly two of them point towards, because of this pricing situation, acting as incentives towards greater concentration. And this is even more so of a problem when you look at the industry structure in our country. And this is data that we analyzed from the National Broadband Map for 5 states in particular, and we went county by county, determining what portion of the population is served only by 1 or 2 carriers. And obviously the underlying assumption being that if you have 2 carriers, you don't have competition. And if you have 1, obviously you have a monopoly situation. Now, obviously in urban counties, you don't have a problem in these 5 states. But if you move to rural counties, the portion of the population served by 1 or 2 is extremely high. Now, this is the situation today. I presented you with the trends towards a situation that could accelerate even further by virtue of preserving this price inequality. So all this to say that something needs to be done. And I'm being less prescriptive on this because we'll probably leave the panel to discuss prescriptions. But I'm trying to emphasize the urgency, just purely from the evidence, to indicate that we got to move into this direction. And those are my conclusions. Limited investment, there's a degradation on service quality, there's the current market conditions are preventing these carriers to even consider 5G, and this is bad for rural America. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katz, and we can bring our panel up now and get them situated. All right. So first up, what we'll do is, just ask each of the panelists, in fact, we can just go right down the line, starting with Steve Barry, to just give, just a few minutes to kind of offer their perspective, because we have all very different stakeholders here with respect to the impact of BDS. So first up is Stephen Barry, who's President and CEO of the Competitive Carriers Association. Steve?
Thank you, Michael. Well, first of all, let me thank New America Foundation and Michael for hosting us at this wonderful facility. It's phenomenal to be here. And also thank Dr. Katz for his phenomenal work here on the BDS issue. As you know, and you have heard from him, this is a huge issue for us. Many of the FCC have said we have to get to 5G. Tom Wheeler, chairman of the FCC, and quite frankly, every one of the commissioners have indicated how important it is the U.S. leads the world in 5G, and we need to get there. I think you heard from Dr. Katz why the small, rural, regional carriers are so concerned about accessing the 5G world. This BDS and BDS services are critical cost points to our ability to do that. In the last few years, we've had a lot of activity at the FCC. Since Chairman Wheeler has been there, we've had rules for the 600 megahertz auction. We've had a 600 megahertz forward and reverse and forward auction. Now we're going into another round. We've had 11,000 megahertz of spectrum made available for 5G services, which we're hoping that we can get there. Not to even mention something called the net neutrality order, which has already been litigated and appealed and continues to be a major issue in the telecom world. All this happened in 148 weeks that Tom Wheeler has been chairman. The BDS proceeding has been around over 600 weeks. So think about it. 600, 4 times as long as Mr. Wheeler's tenure at the FCC. And we're still talking about the need for this. The action was originally brought by AT&T when AT&T was concerned about backhaul issues and their ability to compete in a marketplace when they didn't have access to backhaul. We find ourselves very similar in the same situation, except now we're going into a new era of 5G services. In rural America, we believe one of the main purposes of the BDS proceeding is actually ensure that we can make it into the 5G world, and in rural America that's going to be extremely difficult. We believe that the 5G industrial IoT will hold great promise for rural America if our carriers can offer those choices by the time we get to 5G. So real quick, I would just say that time now is to act. We've been talking about it for a long time. Many of our carriers have said we will live with the results of the data and the information, and a decision is way overdue. In rural America, we might not be the first in rural America to actually see the benefits, but we'll surely be some of the most benefited by a 5G world. 40%, almost 40% of rural America does not have access to high-speed broadband. Only 4% are lacking that opportunity in urban, suburban America. I think we're at a seminal point here of whether we can actually get to that 5G world, 4G, 4G advanced, LTE, and then 5G. And all of our carriers are trying to figure out how do we get there. So we believe that Encompass and Verizon has bravely stepped up to the plate and provided what we think is a very reasonable, sound, and a very attractive solution to getting us to that opportunity to find a pathway to 5G. You know, there's going to be a huge investment in wireless networks if you get to 5G. You just heard from Dr. Katz. You're going to have to cell site split. You're going to have to add. You're going to have to densify by adding cell sites, adding heterogeneous type of builds, changing your architecture. We want to be able to provide that service to the consumer. So 5G is essential. A reasonable approach is at a hand. I think the data and the information on record show that it is fair, reasonable, and economically sustainable. And then we need to future-proof this so that we don't have another 10 years, 12 years or more of addressing this after 4G, 5G, and beyond. So we think that there should be a test that identifies the competitiveness of a marketplace after this. We disagree with the FCC in the sense that we don't think you should automatically say if you're over 100 megabits speed that it's automatically competitive. I think you have to test the market. We do believe anything less than 100 megabits in a market is probably and should be non-competitive because, quite frankly, you can barely sustain a 4G, much less a 5G service for even one wireless carrier in an area when you have less than 100 megabits of service download. So we want to get there along with our consumers and our customers, and we want to provide quality service. We believe that we have an opportunity, and with a test that gives us an opportunity to ensure that we have a progressive, enhanced network investment as we move down the road, that quite frankly is the best way to go. And I think I'll stop there and turn it over. Thank you.
Next is Matt Wood, who is the Policy Director for Free Press.
I think just to break ranks and prove my independence, I'm going to stay seated, so no offense to you.
Either way, it's fine.
Okay. I'm lazy. That's the way it is. No, so thank you so much, Michael, for having me here again. You know, the question might come up, why are you here with wireless carriers or with competitive carriers or with giant businesses that buy these kinds of services? What's the problem? Why does this matter to real people? And I think that is truly important to stress, and my role here, frankly, is to say this does matter to real people and to people who are paying too much. These prices don't just get soaked up by wireless carriers or by businesses. They have to then pass them along to somebody, and the casualty of what is oftentimes a very arcane and seemingly unusual war between companies at the FCC really are consumers and people who use the internet, people who rely on not just the services in communications terms provided by the kinds of companies that Colleen represents, but all the other services those companies provide. So I laugh sometimes. It's, sometimes you hear, well, it's just the internet companies that care about something like this. Well, tell me who isn't an internet company today. Every company relies on communications. Every school and every anchor institution relies on it. And of course, we all rely on it. Those wireless connections numbers are eye-popping. And 300 million times a little bit of extra profit, and it's not just a little bit, but times a little bit of extra profit that is gained by monopolists in these markets is a lot of money that's coming out of the pockets of the people we hope to represent day to day here in Washington in front of the FCC. Steve stole one of my favorite lines too. I love the fact that AT&T is the one that filed the original petition for rulemaking here in 2005, and it's touching that you go to the weeks thing too. It reminds me of a parent who's still measuring their kid's age in years and months, when they're 5 years old or something, right? It's like 600 weeks. Well, yeah, 2005. That's a long time ago, and so that's why I think that it's just laughable when we hear we don't have enough data yet, or that the FCC should keep delaying. I think there's just no disputing the numbers anymore. The 73% of carrier locations that are monopolies, the 97 that are duopoly at best. And sometimes the incumbents in these markets will say things have changed and we have some cable competitors these days. Well, that's true to a point. It's not true in 73% of your locations. It's barely true in another quarter of them. So yes, the FCC should be taking all these numbers they've taken and gathered and should crunch them and find out where there is actual competition and not make the same mistake that AT&T so rightly complained about a decade ago by testing for potential competition with really no regard for whether it actually happened and with no regard for whether prices went down. There's a lot of headroom here that these companies have been enjoying for a decade now, and the data is in. There's really no disputing it, and they're really their last refuge, and where I'll stop in the intro is sometimes when they finally give up the ghost and stop trying to claim that it's competitive when the numbers are just so bad, for the ILEX case, they say, well, it's okay. Monopoly is actually better for you anyway. If you let us make all this money, we promise to invest it. And if you don't let us make the money, on the contrary, we will not invest. We'll take our ball and go home. And that's something that Free Press has done a lot of work on over the last several years, these investment apocalypse claims that even common sense safeguards will somehow destroy American business and industry. I think the people up here on the panel can tell you that's not the case. This will actually promote investment by the other 99.9% of companies who are not just providing special access services, but who are actually purchasing them and using them. And that's why I think the Verizon and Compass proposal is so noteworthy. You know, even Verizon realizes that they are not just a seller of these services anymore. They are a purchaser too. They're providing content, they're providing wireless in places where they aren't the incumbent anymore on the wireline side. And the case for reform is so solid and so hard to deny that it's just the last few companies holding out denying it. That's hurting people that we represent, and we hope that the FCC will act quickly to get beyond the delay tactics and really finally reform this market that's been in such bad shape for the past decade and more.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Next is John Windhausen, who is the Executive Director of the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition. Shelby.
Good. Thank you, Michael. So I'm also not going to talk directly about wireless, although I agree with everything that Dr. Katz has said and that Steve has talked about, but I'm going to talk about anchor institutions and their need for greater broadband. And I'm going to build off some of the things that Matt was just talking about, because the anchor institutions that we represent are not just the schools and health institutions and libraries, but also the community colleges, the public media organizations, public housing, basically any institution that is serving the public interest and providing essential, valuable services to their communities. And they have big demands for broadband. And that's why we became interested in this proceeding early on. I think last time I was on the stage, I talked about the fact that COSN, the Consortium for School Networking, had done a survey of their schools earlier this year, and they found that the #1 issue faced by school technology leaders is lack of broadband. And it had risen from number 3 on their list to #1 on the list of priorities for schools. And we also saw evidence in the E-rate record a couple of years ago about how schools and libraries have faced 2 big problems. One is high prices, and the second is the lack of competition for their services. So we looked at this whole special access BDS proceeding and said, here's an opportunity to solve both of those issues. By lowering prices and putting downward pressure on the rates, that's going to translate into direct benefits. It's going to allow schools, libraries, health providers to buy higher capacity broadband that they need. It's also going to facilitate more competition because, as I think we all know, these high capacity data services are often purchased on a wholesale basis. They're inputs to the services that schools and libraries provide or purchase. So in other words, schools and libraries and health providers, they're buying a lot of special access. They may not realize they're buying it because it's bundled into their retail services, but it's a big component of their costs. We became a little concerned in this proceeding when the FCC decided to change the name from special access to business data services, because we're not businesses, right? And this is one of the reasons the Shelby Coalition exists, to be honest with you, is that oftentimes the needs of anchor institutions fall through the cracks. The industry tends to divide the world between business and residential. And we're the anchor institutions that need enormous amounts of bandwidth, but we don't have the revenues since we're government-supported organizations. So we're their advocate because these anchor institutions need that level of priority. So you'll hear in my comments, I tend to use the word special access more than BDS, and that's the reason. So not just because I think we're special. But that was the initial source of concern for us. But as this proceeding has gone along, I've become even more and more concerned as we've looked at the evidence that's submitted in the record. One of our members, Kellogg and Sovereign, a consulting firm, an E-rate consulting firm in Oklahoma, submitted evidence on the record of the outrageous prices that their schools and libraries in rural areas of Oklahoma are paying. And it's really quite, actually the word that they used in their filing was stunned. They were stunned at the extraordinary prices that are being charged. And one of their examples that they cite in their filing is the fact that oftentimes the school and library only received 1 bid when they put out an RFP, and it's from the CLEC, not from the ILEC. And in this case that they document here, the CLEC total charges for the year was about $220,000. Of that $220,000, $209,000 was being paid to the underlying ILEC, in this case AT&T. So you can see 95% of the costs of being charged to the schools and libraries in rural Oklahoma is because of the underlying special access that was being purchased from AT&T. The CLEC's charges on top of that were really fairly minimal and competitive, and that's symptomatic of the kinds of difficulties, not just in Oklahoma, but around the country. The other piece of evidence, which was really maybe even more concerned about the marketplace, is this latest finding by the FCC in July, where they found that AT&T had violated the lowest corresponding price rule in the E-rate program. Now, I won't go into a lot of details about what that is, but the essence of it is that the state of Florida deregulated the rates for these services in 2011. And the FCC found that AT&T had raised its rates every year after that, 4 straight years, to the point where they were charging schools and libraries 400% higher rates than they were charging others in the state of Florida. So to us, that looks like a prima facie example of what happens when you deregulate too early, when you deregulate based on the hope that competition will develop, and it doesn't develop. The incentives are from those single providers to raise their rates to extraordinary levels. And not only that, but the FCC came out with this notice of apparent liability against AT&T, and AT&T responded and said they just tried to justify those charges. They said those charges were acceptable and legal. So this is the kind of dynamic that's happening in the marketplace, and that's why we're not just concerned about the marketplace, but we're very supportive of the direction that the FCC is going here. I know the Verizon Encompass deal has, I applaud them, as Matt did, for trying to bring together a kind of a compromise on this issue. We're pleased that it's calling for about a 15% reduction in the rates over the next couple of years. Having said that, there is some evidence that the rate reduction should be even greater than that. If you go back and look at the Consumer Federation of America study that Mark Cooper did, he found that the overcharges per year are about $15 billion in overcharges per year out of a $45 billion market. So right there, it suggests that the overcharges amount to about 33% of what a competitive market should charge. So a 15% reduction is called for in this Verizon Encompass agreement is a good start. It's a good step in the right direction. We're hopeful that actually the FCC goes further and reduces rates more. And overall, let me just step back and summarize. It's not because we're interested in just our own institutions. Certainly that is a reason, but the bigger, broader public interest reason is the services that we provide are so valuable to our communities. It's the schools that are doing digital learning. It's the libraries that are doing makerspaces and trying to extend the value of their broadband services out into the community. It's the telehealth applications. I spoke to a hospital just yesterday, and a woman said that there's a hospital in rural Virginia that can't afford a mammography machine to do mammograms because they don't have the bandwidth. And this isn't a rural health clinic, it's in a hospital. They can't afford to get enough broadband. So the value of this special access BDS proceeding, whatever you want to call it, is ultimately we're going to have greater services available to the consumers and available better health care, better quality of education, and better quality of life.
All right, thanks, John. Next is Colleen Boothby, who is counsel to the Ad Hoc Telecommunications Users Committee. Colleen?
Thanks, Mike. Ad Hoc is a 36, 37-year-old organization that participates at the FCC in rulemakings and other proceedings. We are a group of large Fortune 500 companies, about 9 of the Fortune 100, and the group's primary principle, organizing principle, is that if a market is competitive, we push for deregulation. We want the FCC out of the way. We can take care of ourselves. And if the market's not competitive, we want the FCC to do its job, and its job is to regulate prices and keep prices low. BDS, or special access prices, have been on the committee's agenda since 1985, when the Commission, the FCC, investigated the first set of special access tariffs and ordered multi-million-dollar refunds because the ILECs had overpriced special access. In 2002, after the Commission We passed pricing flexibility rules that deregulated special access prices or BDS prices. We alerted AT&T, which prompted their petition for rulemaking and mandamus to the DC Circuit, to the fact that the first thing ILECs did when their rates were deregulated was raise them. So if you have a set of rules that purport to differentiate between competitive and non-competitive areas, and those rules turn areas loose from regulation, and the first thing the carrier does is raise prices, that's not the sort of behavior you expect to see in a competitive market, a unilateral price increase of as much as 25 to 50%. So we went to the commission and said, your deregulatory initiatives, people talk about premature deregulation. We were a little more blunt. We said, you bet on the come, as they say in Las Vegas, and you lost. You were so confident that competition was coming over the hill, the cavalry that's going to save us all from the need for regulation. You were so confident of that you deregulated before there was sufficient competition to protect consumers. In my case, business consumers. So the members of ad hoc are like most major corporations in America. They buy a lot of special access. They buy a lot of BDS. BDS services, both supposedly old-fashioned TDM services like DS1s and DS3s, as well as new IP technologies, packet technologies like Ethernet, are the building blocks of all internal corporate networks. And as much as it is a cliche to say that we live in an information economy and information age, it's also kind of true. So most business is done in America with the help of copious amounts of IT and network services. The cloud is something that we used to call the network, and the network is built with BDS services. So ad hoc continues to be concerned that the commission not falter. The last time we started to get some recognition of the problem was in the 2004-2005 timeframe when we went to the commission and said, A, they're raising their prices in these deregulated areas, and B, have you looked at their rates of return? The carriers were earning 185% return on investment. This is after depreciation, taxes, and amortization. And the commission's response at that point was to eliminate the rate of return reporting requirements. So now we have a data collection, and we have carriers complaining about having to file this data. Well, the other data that's the most useful barometer of whether you're overpricing your services, the carriers petitioned to have removed. So the commission went out and collected additional data, more data, and we think a more robust data collection than they've had in the past. And it has revealed all of the competitive problems that Dr. Katz described. One final note, ad hoc is pleased to see that Verizon is willing to reach across the divide and talk to other carriers, competitive carriers, and come up with a compromise. We think the numbers in the Verizon and Compass proposal are nowhere near high enough. John thinks 20%. Our economic analysis is that we need a 22% reduction over the next 2 years if we want rates to be down at the level they would have been at if the commission had just kept its price caps or incentive regulation in place since 2005 instead of eliminating it prematurely.
Thank you, Colleen. And finally, Angie Cronenberg, who is Chief Advocate and General Counsel at Encompass.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. So Encompass is a trade association that represents internet and competitive network companies. And the reason why this proceeding has been so important to us over the last 10 plus years are the exact reasons you've already heard by the other panelists. I think it is just notable the impact that can happen to the economy when BDS consumers are paying fair and reasonable rates. As a parent, it just boggles my mind that schools would be spending way more than they need to get basic access that is required for our children to succeed in today's world. Think of the money that could be used in other ways for those children. We could have smaller class sizes because schools could hire more teachers. This is a very important proceeding for the entire economy. It's not just about rural wireless carriers. It's not just about select companies that are offering some competition to the incumbent carriers. And it's not just about large businesses. It is ultimately about all of us and what it is that we are actually having to pay because incumbent carriers are making way more than they should in non-competitive areas. It is absolutely an historic moment when Verizon and Encompass came together to work on a framework that would allow the commission to move forward with reform. And the reason why I say this is because we have been adversaries for over a decade in this proceeding. But yet it was apparent that the future of our nation is critical because of BDS. And that is why we came together. It's the future of the networks, both the wireline and wireless networks. It's the future of rural health care. It's the future of schools and libraries. This is why we came together. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes, and I know we're getting close to the time that we're going to open up to questions, but I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about why it is that we came together in this framework and who was represented in this room. So we had a number of incumbent and competitive exchange carriers that were represented around the table. We had wireless at the table. We had international companies at the table. We had pure CLECs at the table, in addition to Verizon. And it was a true compromise. It took months and months for us to produce basically 3 letters that sets the framework out. And some have said, oh, it's really not a compromise, but I would say all you need to do is go look at the filings in the proceeding before we submitted the very last letter, which lays out the entire framework for the commission. Go check to see what my member companies were saying. It is a true compromise. They were not arguing for a 15% reduction in the first round of comments. They were arguing for something much higher than that, as Colleen indicated her companies are in the position to assert. So it was a true compromise on our part, and it's been a true compromise on Verizon's part too. And we think that it is a framework that the commission can use to build reform that will make a difference for consumers. It will make a difference for the carriers that Steve represents. It will make a difference for all of those schools and libraries. It's going to make a difference for the commission's E-rate program. The commission will be able to connect more schools through the E-rate program. It will make a difference in the rural health care program. The commission will be able to affect so much more change and implement broadband throughout the nation. So this is really an important proceeding. We just commend the commission and its staff. We know that the docket is huge. We know there's a lot to work through, which is also one of the reasons why we wanted to make this framework known so people could comment on it, and the commission hopefully will use it as a basis to implement an order of change. And we would ask that they keep the pedal to the metal. I think at one point the chairman was quoted that he's going to race through the tape, and we hope that that same spirit will continue in this docket and that he will complete this proceeding before the end of the year. So once these changes are implemented, I think we can expect to see many benefits throughout the economy. It will reverberate in everyone's lives as a result. So, and I'm happy to take additional questions.
All right, thank you, Angie. All right, so we will get to audience questions and comments soon, but we have a little more time to, I think, probe on a few of these points. So I'll ask a few questions. I mean, I wanted to start with one stakeholder that isn't here, among many, is startups, startup businesses, which, in fact, one of our board members, former chairman James Fallows, has had this whole series about how businesses incubating all over the country, revitalizing a lot of small towns and communities. So earlier this week, we saw a Hill letter from a number of startups on this issue. Can anyone want to comment on why startups are getting involved in this debate? Does it make some difference for innovation and?
Yeah, I think it goes back, I hope, to what I said earlier. It's just laughable to talk about anymore, internet companies or broadband users, as if that isn't a synonym for everybody at this point in time. So you've heard the rates, you've heard the overcharges. You know, if this is not just a big part of your cost of doing business, but the biggest part, or an absolute bar to doing business because you can't get service at affordable rates, you know, you just can't get there from here. Obviously, that's going to take away from ability to do lots of great things and invest in all sorts of other products. Not just the internet companies, but internet economy, I think, is another thing. Colleen talked about this well. I mean, we said it a lot, but it's true. And so if there's any kind of reduction in the incumbent provider's revenues, we hear that that's anti-business sometimes. Well, no, there's lots of businesses in the country. There are some very large ones that do it, but it's only a very small handful by comparison that sell these services, and all the rest of us are purchasers of it. And that includes individuals, although usually indirectly, wireless companies, big companies, small companies, startups, everyone in between. So it's almost like a no-brainer. And as Colleen said also, you know, yeah, competition's great if it happens and when it actually works to reduce rates, but when it doesn't happen, and when we have a decade-long, or you might even say century-long experiment to see if it's coming around the corner, you know, it's long past time to stop waiting for it to happen and to make sure the FCC is in fact doing its job to assure reasonable rates in places where they're not coming up.
To add a thought too, it's not just a matter of lower prices, and even big companies can be caught in the same squeeze that kills a startup. One of our members, one of the ad hoc members, built a big customer care center out west, and in a non-competitive market, service quality drops off as well, and not just because you drop calls, because there aren't enough cell sites to handle traffic. Service quality drops off because an installation date gets pushed off and pushed off. So we had a member built a big call center, had to carry nearly 10,000 employees for 3 months when the incumbent failed to meet the deadline for turning up the broadband service, the BDS service, to that facility. And why did it take them so long? Why could they go 3 months past their deadline? Because they can, because they're the only game in town. So the other advantage from our perspective of competition is the competitive spur to be a better quality, to get a better quality product to the market, to be more innovative, to be more customer-centered. My members are all very customer-centered because they all operate in very competitive markets. And they're being very innovative in their use of the internet. If you've had to do an insurance claim lately, you put that online. Every time you swipe a credit card, that's a data service. That's a data transmission from your point-of-sale terminal in a store to a credit card validation network somewhere. So we're innovating. We're very dependent on these products. We have to be customer responsive. It's jaw-dropping how often the quality of service you get from an incumbent really suffers from the lack of competition to drive them to just do a better job.
And the beauty of the framework that we have offered is that the commission would only regulate where there's not enough competition. So we certainly recognize that the competition that's been created in few markets, that needs to continue, and the commission, should be hands-off. But in many, many markets, as the data has shown, as we've discussed, it's appropriate for the commission to regulate. And the data has also shown how high the prices are in those areas where the price deregulation happened too soon. And so that's just another reason why it's really important for the commission to not take a pass this time, to go ahead and make the right call here.
Right.
If you live or work or as a startup, any place other than an urban suburban area, Dr. Katz's study, I think, was very clear. You have essentially two choices. Either you have degraded service because you don't get access, which is harmful to the consumer, or you, as a wireless carrier, you don't deploy the services that, quite frankly, business and even a small entrepreneur will need if they want to start up their business in a remote area. It's going to get to the point that you have to have access to the advanced high-speed internet access if you're going to be successful. And I think several years ago we did a study on jobs. And we haven't talked a lot about jobs here, but we did a study about 4 years ago with Dr. Katz showing that of the states that had less than 90% penetration of high-speed broadband at that time, and we only studied I think it was nine states at the time that we could identify and had the data on. Huge increase in job opportunities for those 14 states, over 100,000 jobs in rural America. But what was even more interesting was something I think it was a surprise, that the median income of the entire state went up 3.5% to 5% when you actually could build out those rural areas and provide that type of service. And I think it's because the entrepreneurship that generates has a real impact on the economy throughout the state.
And I'd like to add one more thought. The kind of technology we're talking about is not just brand new gee whiz stuff. One of my members has an OC-192 in their headquarters facility. That's a big pipe. They're a big company. They also have 18,000 T1s. T1s are the smallest BDS service you can buy. They handle about 24 voice grade lines if you were going to use them for voice. If you use them for data, it's about 1.5 megabits per second. They have 18,000 of them nationwide because they have operations in a lot of rural areas. They're not asking for fiber to be rolled out to those areas. They're not demanding that space-age technology be deployed. T1s have been around for decades. They can't even get the most basic building block of service where they need it at an affordable price.
So Colleen, that's a great point, and it relates as well to this whole kind of debate about, well, how does this proceeding relate to upgrading that infrastructure? Because we'll want more, higher connectivity speeds in the future, probably even those businesses. So I want to, loop back to the investment argument that Matt mentioned in his opening remarks. I mean, we've heard from the dominant BDS providers, the ILECs, that this proceeding will negatively impact investment. That's their mantra at the FCC. It may be about the only argument they have that gets any traction at all, particularly in rural areas. They'll say, well, who's going, why would we invest more if we can't charge these, these high prices? So, how do you all, or a few of you, respond to the investment, we won't invest argument?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it not to be true in so many cases because companies will invest when there's a demand. So they don't only invest when they can get supra competitive profits. And if they want to make that claim, as I said, it really boils down to nothing more than monopoly is good. If you let us make a lot more money, we will promise to give you some of it back in the form of investment. We just don't see the proof of it. I mean, the investments have not been harmed by these kinds of common sense regulations in the past. And it's really a way to hold hostage all these companies and all these anchor institutions and all of these individual users that are forced to pay that higher rate with no alternative in places where there is no alternative.
You can almost make the argument that with the higher rates, supra higher rates, and the fact that they dominate the market, that's actually a disincentive to invest, because they don't have to invest anymore to continue to receive those high levels of high margin return is what some of the ILECs have said it is, and there's no competition. I believe if we're going to have to get to this 5G world, and once you address the BDS issue, they're already putting in Ethernet. They have the opportunity to upgrade the existing facilities. There's a huge demand out there. I think they'll want to continue to dominate the markets that they're in, and in order to do that, they're going to have to get, under these type of proceedings, they're going to have a microscope put on that pricing relationship, and they're going to have to get competitive, not only prices, but to competitive network enhancements. And that's where we have to get to if we're going to get to 5G. The wireless carriers know we're going to have to invest a lot of money to get our networks ready for a 5G type of technology. You can't have the bottleneck being the back end. The backhaul is at a 20-year-old technology. I think they're going to step up to the plate and want to continue to dominate the market, is my opinion.
One other thought, that the type of investment that a wireline company makes is very different from the type of investment that a wireless company makes. A wireless company that wants to split a cell has to find a tower or find a location and install hardware and run backhaul. A wireline company that wants to go from a copper T1 to fiber Ethernet just has to pull a different medium through existing trenches, existing right-of-ways, existing conduit, existing truck roads, existing poles. All of their capital expenditures have been made and invested in infrastructure that's used to deliver these wireline services. All that changes when I go from T1 to Ethernet is I just pull fiber where the copper was. All the other investment, digging up the streets and putting those poles in place and entering into leasing agreement with utilities, all the infrastructure involved in a wireline network is very expensive, and it's already been made. That investment has already been made when we're converting from existing technologies to a new one. We're also not asking for some huge leap in volume, in the quantity of service. So a T1 is 1.5 megabits. Under existing technology, if I'm a business and I need a little more than that, I can go to 45 megabits per second from a DS3. But if all I want is like 5, I'd like to go from 1.5 to 5. Ethernet's my only option. That's not asking for a rebuild of the entire network to increase it to unheard of levels. That's asking for a very incremental increase in capacity using 90% existing and fully depreciated plant.
John?
Yeah, if I could just add this argument that the opponents are making about their effect on investment. That was the argument that they made 12 or 15 years ago when the FCC first deregulated this market. They accepted the incumbents' arguments that, okay, if you're deregulated, you're going to invest more. And now we're 12 or 15 years later, we've seen the results of that, and it hasn't worked. The investment hasn't come the way that they told the FCC that it would. We have evidence that, 2 years ago, Chairman Wheeler gave a really good speech about the E-rate program where he documented the rural fiber gap because there has been a lack of investment in these rural areas. And we have evidence that says 42% of schools don't have fiber yet. And even more glaring, 41% of libraries are still only working with a 10 megabit connection. And a lot of these places, they just don't have the high-speed facilities available to them. So most of the incumbent telephone companies have stopped investing in fiber. You know, Verizon's not investing in Fios anymore, and AT&T has put a halt or slowed down its UVerse spending. So that kind of investment, that was the old argument. We tried that argument. It hasn't worked. We need to have a new approach that really fosters greater investment and lower prices so that we can encourage more competitive entry. Because just taking the argument by the incumbents that, oh, if you deregulate them, they'll invest more. If you just take that at face value, we've tried that and it hasn't worked.
Well, and that's because, I mean, I think we all said this, but just to put a finer point on it, competition is what spurs investment, not lack of competition.
That's why they're going into Ethernet now. It's
Right.
only where they face an Ethernet CLEC.
And the analogies to residential areas they're not perfect, but I mean, you know, we heard for years, I'd go to panels like this and hear AT&T and cable representatives say, nobody needs a gigabit. That's crazy. Who would want that even? And then what do you know, Google Fiber doesn't really do it everywhere. They show up in a couple cities and suddenly AT&T is rolling out faster services and cable is. And to Colleen's point too about the upgrades, sometimes it's not even a new wire through the same trench. Sometimes it's quite literally a software upgrade.
Yeah.
So the capacity is oftentimes there. These are very expensive businesses, make no mistake. But the capital intensity happens at the beginning, and then oftentimes after that, especially for the wired providers, they just kind of turn it up without having to do a whole lot more digging.
I mean, one of the fastest growing areas in that middle market ILEC world is what they call SDA, software-defined access. And by software upgrades and switches, they can substantially increase speeds with a software upgrade. So, you know, it's not exactly dollar for dollar cost to upgrade and increase your capacity. And I think data and information in the record show that.
Yeah. Let me get to one more issue before we open it up, which is another tricky issue in this proceeding has been how to treat cable, which is not quite, the legacy wireline, but obviously owns their own plant. So what does the data submitted from cable operators really show about the presence of cable networks as a competitor, and should cable be regulated?
I'd like to take that first. We've been telling the Commission for 10 years that cable services, A, aren't present, and B, aren't equivalent. They aren't substitutable for wireline services. We, as a business, say you're a bank with an ATM network, you can't have that go down for 4 or 5 hours. People want to get their money out. And cable has never signed up. Cable companies have resisted the service level agreements, the SLAs. These are the specifications of service quality that are in every contract for service, latency, jitter, very technical specs. How many nines? How often will the service go down? Will it be up 99.999% of the time? These sort of commitments to quality. Cable companies have failed to step up to that. We reported that to the Commission for many years because that was the experience of our members. The Commission, when it initially deregulated the ILEC services, relied on advertising material from the cable companies where they kept announcing with great fanfare that they were entering the business market. And they still do that. I just got an email yesterday from Comcast telling me about their business service. My members tell me that cable companies don't respond to RFPs. Cable companies don't come by and sell them service. They have called cable companies and asked them to respond to RFPs, and they respond with partial coverage of the area where they need it and no SLAs. And they present a form contract, the kind they're probably used to presenting to a residential customer. That's not how business consumers work. They negotiate their contracts. The record now confirms, the data before the Commission now confirms all of the representations we've been making through these years. That cable, they have great physical plant in residential neighborhoods. They're not built out in business core districts, so they don't always have the facilities in place. And they're still not able to offer the substitutable service for wireline products.
That's a great point. That's why they call it special access.
It's pretty
Because it's
special.
not like your home broadband connection,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's a dedicated connection.
And for wireless carriers, the same thing, the dependability, quality of service standards for a wireless carrier has to be 99.99.9%. It's not the best efforts service quality required for a residential or a small business for that matter. So in some areas, cable has built out in a way that where they provide a competitive alternative, but very few areas. And their service that they provide is not the reliable service that you have to have if you're running your entire network for thousands or millions of people on a wireless platform. It's not a comparable service.
For small to medium-sized businesses, it may be. For the professional office in a strip mall next to a residential area where the cable company already has plant in place, or in New York City. Carriers always want to point to LATA 132. They always want to point to New York City as an example of how business and residential, commercial products coexist, and there's all this cable competition for Verizon. But I think you're kind of hard-pressed to find a city like New York with the same integration of residential and commercial customers. And that's what it takes. Cable plant was deployed primarily to serve residential areas, so it's just not there for many business districts.
So I think the answer you're hearing is it's largely an academic question, but in places where we might find a cable monopolist over special access services or duopolist, well then sure, we're all in favor of technology neutrality. That's kind of a watchword for a lot of people in DC, and we think it should apply here, but it's just you're not seeing that because cable is not really an alternative and not really a dominant provider, to say the least.
If it were, that would be a duopoly. And it, we all know that two companies don't make a market competitive enough. It just means we would have two providers trying to overcharge us for the same service.
Yeah, and if certain businesses need those 5 nines of quality, they may only really have one choice, even if on the books it looks like 2. Right?
Sometimes an IPVPN over an internet connection is just not good enough. So you got to have what we used to call special access, which means a dedicated point-to-point connection.
So let's see if there are any questions and comments from the audience, and you know, please let us know who you are and who you're with. Way in the back was the first up.
Hi, my name is Kevin Carty. I work here at New America in a program that focuses on monopoly and business, so that's why I'm here. And you know, I think a lot of what you're discussing is really interesting and valuable about things that will enhance competition and price controls. But this also seems like an area that could be ripe for a public option, you know, municipal business data services. You know, I'm not exactly up on the tech here, but why not that?
Well, let's ask Tennessee how they feel about that. Right? The FCC has tried this. You know, they have the municipal broadband. They tried to preempt state legislatures who, at the behest of their ILEC constituents, passed legislation prohibiting municipally owned broadband in the 90s, beginning 2000.
Well, I'd say that even there, I mean, it's a great idea. We're very supportive of municipal options. There's no way to paint them all with the same brush, but it's often done by utility companies, electric companies who already have wires, and the same kind of advantages Colleen mentioned for wireline communications companies, where they don't have to start from scratch. And so to say, if we let the cities do it, that's a great idea, and it's certainly a good option to have. It's just, it's not gonna be overnight, to put it mildly. That's a big investment, unless they already have some existing plant they can build on, quite literally.
People sometimes say, well, what about municipal Wi-Fi? You know, you can travel in Europe, and there's some of the oldest, most historic cities in the world, and they have free muni Wi-Fi. There's not enough spectrum in the natural world to accommodate the data demands of businesses. There's just not enough. You know, the New York Clearinghouse, the group of New York banks that clear checks between each other, they run a nationwide network for financial. They move the entire economy over a computer network once a week. There's not enough spectrum to solve this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from an area of Virginia, and southwestern part of Virginia, that had very near Bristol, which was one of the first experiments in the community program, and have relatives that realized how much money was going out the door because the network couldn't sustain itself, nor could it stay up with the developments in the commercial world. And yeah, for Wi-Fi, that may be a good option, but for business data services, the reliability requirements, I don't think even in a cutting edge community that they're willing to dedicate dozens of people to maintain the quality of service that you have to in a business relationship.
And even all those Wi-Fi modems are connected by BDS. That's how they get traffic to an internet server.
If I could just add.
So right here in front.
I'm Nancy Stark. I'm with Capital One.
Hold on just a second.
Oh,
for
here's
the
a
mic.
microphone.
That way they can hear you online.
I'm still Nancy Stark with Capital One. And this is an area of concern to, I think, all banks across the country, because a lot of banks are changing their model of banking and trying to do much more digitally, accommodate, you know, the fact that like my two late 20-somethings have probably never been in a branch, would never go in a branch. Anyway, so my question is primarily to Angie. You said that your proposal is that the FCC will regulate, or in talking about your proposals, you said the FCC will regulate in areas where there is not sufficient competition. So I have two questions. One, how are they measuring sufficient competition? And two, what would you expect to be the timeline for consideration of the proposal?
We do expect the timeline for consideration will be this year. The chairman recently said in his speech just the other day at CTIA that this is critical for 5G deployment, and he's committed to getting BDS reformed through the commission before the end of the year. So that's great news. In terms of how the commission will measure whether or not a market is competitive, so the commission engaged in an intensive data collection just a couple of years ago to look at where is BDS being sold and where is it being purchased. So based on that information, we've been able to see the stats so that there's only in a very small portion of the United States more than 2 providers. So we anticipate that the commission will need to make a decision about how many competitors are enough. Encompass's position is that there should be at least 4 facilities-based providers in a census block or an adjacent census block before that area would be deregulated. Otherwise, the commission should keep a check on prices.
Okay. Yes, right here.
My name is Jack Rapansky, unaffiliated former software developer. Is there any clear delineation between backhaul in the local area or near region as opposed to long haul, transcontinental, et cetera? In other words, you're talking about areas, but of course LA and Washington and New York are not quite in the same area.
BDS, the term BDS sort of muddies those waters a little bit. Special access means access service, so it's intrastate service. The commission has already deregulated interstate inter-exchange service. And that's not at issue in this. So is the local, the final mile. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because there are actually a lot, maybe counterintuitively, there are a lot of providers of the big backbone pipes. That's the capital-intensive business too, but not nearly as capital-intensive as reaching everybody, reaching every business location.
These are the capillaries, not the big arteries.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I guess right up here.
Thank you. I'm from UNESCO, and we've been conducting the last 7 years the impact of broadband and other high-grade investment on rural area. We focus so far on Scandinavia and Japan. We're about to start in Africa. My first question is regarding libraries, museum, healthcare, schools, and so on in rural area. Have you conducted in the United States the impact of BDS on rural area? In the sense, also the most recent development like climate change and education and also entrepreneurship requires in relative terms more broadband for rural area than for urban area today. So to respond to crisis as well as to initiate entrepreneurship and development in those areas, including for farmers, for instance, BDS, it's a must. Have you studied the impact and how it will maybe it could launch a new economic, social, whatever, cultural development? So remote area for us in Scandinavia, in Japan today are the highest priority to equip with not only broadband, but all kind of high-grade services and infrastructures.
So that may be for John?
So I can try, but I'm aware of, there are some studies talking about, in general about the value of broadband for rural areas and the economic growth that can result. There's the Center for Rural Studies that has a study. Are you pointing to Raul? Is he?
Dr. Katz has actually written a book similar on one of the related subjects and is very, very familiar with that. He might be able to help you.
Good resource.
Come up. In fact, I meant to mention that if anybody had questions for Dr. Katz too, that he could join us up here.
Yeah, there are a number of studies. This has been studied quite a bit, not only in the United States, but around the world, with actually quantitative data. I think that we're getting now into the area where we want to measure the ex post facto effect, because we have a lot of forward-looking assessments, but now we have a sort of time series that are sufficiently extensive that we can start seeing what actually happened in particular areas. There are several studies that have been conducted in Canada in that respect, very interesting, particularly in isolated areas. So Canada is one of the countries that is at the forefront. Less so in developing countries just because the data quality is not as good. But if you want afterwards, we can talk and I could refer you to some of those.
We may have time for one last, because I thought there was one more hand. Oh, yes, right there. I knew there was another one.
Hi.
Hi, I'm from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and my question with your definition of rural is with regards to your intense data collection, if tribal areas were considered under rural, or if that is a separate data point, and if you could speak further to maybe unique challenges for those areas.
Well,
So
yeah,
I think, I was going to say, in terms of the commission's data collection, there were no areas that were exempted. So they would have collected data in rural areas, including tribal areas. So I can add that.
Tribal areas, they do designate tribal areas as a supra, what is the term? It's very small density, very light density areas, and they have a designation, but they do collect the data and information on. Matter of fact, we have several of our members that actually provide the service to Navajo Nation and some of the tribal areas, and as far as I know, they were all that data was always included in the survey. Right.
Okay. All right, well, this is perfectly on time then, and which is unusual for us, but we often run over. So I will thank you all for joining us, and please thank our panel and Dr. Katz for all the great information. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.